June. And then we will see what happens next. Lots of talk now about supplies of F-16 fighter jets. That may indeed happen. There may indeed be F-16 supplied to Ukraine. I think there will be. My own view, I know that there is a current view that the intention is to supply F-16s to Ukraine only after the war is over. I think, on the contrary, the intention is to supply these F-16s some point this year. I think that the political pressure in the United States has increased to do that, and of course the Europeans are also on side with this. I think the idea is less to force a change on the battlefield as to intimidate the Russians, to tell the Russians, look, our commitment to Ukraine is indeed open-ended. Even if you defeat this Ukrainian offensive, do understand that you will in that case be facing more and more weapon systems supplied by us to Ukraine, including F-16s. You'll be facing, in other words, a conflict in the air where historically we in the West are strong. I think that that is the intention. And I think the intention also is to supply these F-16s in order to force the Russians, or to put pressure on the Russians, to agree to that proposal that was discussed in Politico a few days ago, which is to get the Russians to agree to a frozen conflict in Ukraine. The Russians, by the way, have been talking extensively about the F-16. My strong impression is that they are unimpressed and unintimidated by it. They probably do not think that the F-16 is a game-changer system in the conflict in Ukraine. I think they sense that they can deal with it quite easily. But there is unfortunately something else. John Helmer, at his site Dancing with Bears, has pointed out that there has been a huge NATO air exercise carried out in Europe. And I'm afraid that he is suggesting, and he might very well be right, and I suspect there are some people in Moscow who think he probably the same way that he does, that this big exercise is ultimately a preparation by NATO, at least a dress rehearsal of some kind of air campaign by NATO in Ukraine. And he may be right. It may be that what the Americans are trying to convey to the Russians, apparently there's very little communication with the Russians underway at the moment, but what the Americans might be trying to convey to the Russians is this: look, even if you win your battles, even if you defeat this Ukrainian offensive that's coming, even if you are able to deal with the F-16s, even if you've knocked out our Patriot missile systems, you still won't be able to win the war, because in the end, we are prepared to intervene directly in the conflict ourselves. The fact that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, seems to be going out of his way to rule out this possibility, to say that Germany isn't going to supply F-16s, that it's not going to become directly involved in the war. All of that makes me think that Helmer might be right and that these plans are indeed there. Because why would Scholz be denying categorically, repeatedly, something which he knows isn't going to happen? Isn't it more consistent with the way that he's acted up to this point, that he resists pressure to escalate until the point comes when he crumbles and agrees to escalate? And at the moment, he's going through the dance of appearing to be reluctant to go along with these plans for escalation. Probably in the knowledge that he will himself eventually agree to them. So this is something that I'm afraid has to be taken seriously. Helmer might very well be right about this. We will see. But in the meantime, the Russians do have the initiative, even as they prepare for the Ukrainian offensive, which hardly anybody any longer appears to think can succeed or can achieve the great ambitious objectives that were being mooted a few months ago, severing the land bridge and all of that. Well, we will see what comes, and we will see what the Russians do and how they respond, and what the Ukrainians do and what happens over the next few weeks. But before ending this program, I do want to discuss another topic, which is, again, the sanctions war and the state of the Russian economy. Now, there's been an interesting article in The Guardian by its economics editor, Larry Elliott. Now, I should say Larry Elliott is to some extent a leftover, if you like, from older days when The Guardian was a rather different newspaper from the one that it is now. And he does still take, shall we say, a more traditional leftist view, a more skeptical view of things generally than the sort of neoliberal, neocon faction that seems to run the Guardian nowadays. I might be wrong about this, and if so, my apologies to Mr. Elliott. But anyway, he's written an article, and bear in mind, it's economics editor, and it's about sanctions. And he says the West's tightening of Russian sanctions is a sign of failure. And he is absolutely right. He says that the attempt by the Western powers to tighten sanctions is a sign that the sanctions actually are not working. And he says that despite talk of quick victory, there's been no knockout blow in the economic war, let alone signs that freezing assets, targeting oligarchs, seeking alternative energy sources, and depriving Russia of vital components has brought a change of heart in the Kremlin. And then he points out that whenever sanctions have been used in the past, their record has been mixed. He says that there's a risk in talking up such effect as the sanctions have had on the Russian economy, in the sense that, as Western policymakers know, their own voters are suffering from the collateral damage. Dearer energy, rising food prices, and falling living standards. A rare admission, by the way, in the Western economics commentariat, that the sanctions are indeed playing a role in the so-called cost of living crisis that many Western countries are experiencing at the moment. But then he goes to the heart of the issue. He says that the past 15 months have exposed the difficulties in laying economic siege to a country as well endowed with natural resources and technical nous as Russia. And he says that early forecasts from the International Monetary Fund that the Russian economy would contract by 8.5% in 2022 have since been revised to a 2.5% fall. In fact, it's a 2.1% fall, and my own view is that that figure is going to be revised at some point, and we're probably going to get a contraction of around 1.5%. That's my own view. I'm not going to go into the reasons why. He then goes on to say the IMF is expecting growth of 0.7% this year. Inflation is running at a 3-year low of 2.3%, lower than in the United States, the United Kingdom, or the Eurozone. And that figure, by the way, is correct. 2.3% is the current rate of inflation in Russia at an annualized basis. And this in advance of the summer, when historically prices in Russia tend to fall. Now, of course, that may not happen this year. We're dealing with all kinds of statistical quirks and fancies, but still, nonetheless, overall, the economy is the inflation situation in Russia does look to be pretty stable. And he does say that things might be worse on the surface, worse than they appear in Russia on the surface. He says that there are reports of a brain drain of skilled workers and of shortages of spare parts. The last is indisputably true. There have been shortages, but this is the point about understanding the problem with shortages of spare parts. When spare parts are in short supply, that incentivizes producers to make them. So it is only a momentary thing, generally, when dealing with a technologically advanced economy like Russia's, with a big industrial base. Of course, you can also import some of these spare parts from other parts of the world, and the Russians are indisputably doing that. But this is a temporary problem. And of course, as Russian industry starts to replace some of these spare parts, its indices actually grow. A statistical fact which people don't understand much about. And as to the brain drain of skilled workers, the accumulating reports that, well, firstly, this was overstated, but there's accumulated reports appearing in the Russian media, anecdotal reports, that these are going into reverse, and a conversation with a Russian acquaintance, who is, by the way, an opponent of the Putin government, but who has been in London. Anyway, he has actually said that many Russians who did leave Russia are indeed planning to return because they found that their living standards in the West are significantly lower than what they were in Russia. And anyway, that's covering that point. And Larry Elliott goes on to say, 3 questionable assumptions underpin the West's belief that the economic war would be swiftly over. The first is that Russia would run out of money and so be unable to finance its military action, and that hasn't really happened because the Russians have had little difficulty finding buyers for their oil and gas. And of course, they've got enormous financial resources within Russia itself, a fact which is consistently missed and misunderstood as well. Russia now has a highly developed financial sector. Didn't always have that, but it does now. He says the second assumption was that the entire global community would be united in opposition to Russian aggression, and this has proved optimistic, and that's putting it mildly. And he says the final assumption is that the Russia of 2023 is no different to the Soviet Union of the 1980s, a basket case that will wilt under pressure from the West's superior economic model. Yet, as the US economist James Galbraith pointed out in a recent paper, Russia has an excellent education system, plenty of technical know-how, and industrial plants that have been built by Western multinationals since the end of the Cold War. So sanctions provided an incentive for the Russians to substitute homegrown products for Western imports. Though some techniques remain to be mastered, Russia is not short of any underlying ingredients: food, fuel, materials, scientific and engineering talent. Whether its economic leadership is of a caliber to use these resources effectively is an open question, but so far the contrary evidence is not compelling. On one point, I will push back a little on James Galbraith. The Russians do indeed have lots of factories now built in Russia by Western multinationals, especially car factories and things like that. But of course, it's a mistake to assume that all of the old Soviet industrial plants were just relics of the 19th century. Again, this underestimates the technological and industrial sophistication of parts of the former Soviet economy, as I have seen for myself. Just saying, just to make that little point, and of course a lot of that old industrial know-how and technological know-how is now being strongly revived and is playing a big role in what we are now seeing. Well, all of this happens to have taken place